The Tender Witch, Chapter 5, The Langstons. When Mary's 2 children entered the front sitting room, she met them both with cheek kisses and hellos until they reciprocated. I found myself in the halo of light cast by the great window, watching on and not knowing how to intercede as a stranger on looking so intimate a gesture. I put down my book. Thankfully, Mary was an aware host. "All right, Dorothy, Otto. I would love you two to meet Miss Eloise. She's been a family friend for many years now. I know we were expecting her dear mother, but Eloise will be the one to stay with us. If you would remember her, Dorothy, I believe it's been well over a decade since you last saw each other." Mary was beaming and let her children go to meet me, a mother hen loosing her 2 chicks. But Dorothy was near a hen herself. Otto looked more like a dawdling rooster with a perky nose. Dorothy was tall and thin like her mother, dressed in her school's uniform with a low-hanging skirt and an embroidered coat. Her hair was a gorgeous blonde, more colorful than my own, with streaks of caramel in the braid, but she wore it simply pinned under her cap. She still had a child's roundness which filled in her cheeks and chin, and her lashes were dark like her eyes. I felt my shoulders become rigid as this girl, only some years under me, who I last knew as little more than a youngling, approached me with an eager smile. There was scarcely a hint of the usual shyness in those her age. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Eloise. I don't know if you remember me much at all, but I believe we used to play a mean game of hide-and-seek behind the sofas." She spoke with charm. For an instant, I had that warm sense of what it was like to visit here as a child and pretend to have a sibling. "A pleasure, Dorothy, and just Eloise suits me. I'm sorry if I'm not fit to remember so many years back. If I could recall anything, it may have been your favorite color, some shade of pink, if I were lucky to guess." Dorothy laughed, now looking much younger with so bright a sound. I smiled. Her girly air and endearing sincerity were a comfort to me, and she embraced me, her hands pressing into my back. But there was a nagging in my heart that whatever happened in this house was a temporary gladness. I would only be here a week. "Pink still suits me," she said, and pulled Otto forward by the back of his blazer. "And this little rascal, the terror of the house, is the infamous Otto. Let's see if he'll let go of his hold on me. Go on, mind your manners." Little Otto was holding the side of Dorothy's skirt, as he had been when he first arrived, his small hands covered in pencil smudgings. He couldn't have been older than Stacy's own Edgar, certainly not near enough to the age of 10. If he was older, his slanted height and bewildered eyes gave me no clue. Dorothy nudged him forward. I bent down with my hands on my knees, trying to look unimposing. I held out one of the hard candies I had slipped from a bowl on the parlor shelves during my reading, likely one he wasn't big enough to reach. He turned his face to me, and to the candy in my palm, the object I hoped would seal our pact of friendship. He waited for my introduction, and minded his learned manners from the goodly etiquette's book. "Hi, Otto. I know you won't remember me, but I think I remember you." I moved the candy towards him, and he took it with great focus. And this was true. Of the few times I had ever been beyond North End alongside my mother and father, I could vaguely recall the miracle that seemed to me to exist with a heartbeat small and feeble and constant. My mother had whispered in my ear that a baby was one proof of the world's power to create life, and we shared that power. I think I once sang you lullabies in the months before you were born. I'm sorry if they were no good." "Thank you." His cheeks puffed up in a victorious smile, one tooth very much out of place and several others missing. "It's nice to meet you, Eloise." I made a shushing motion as he hid the candy in his pocket, but he giggled loudly in his mischief. Mary shook her head. "Eloise, I swear you'll bring down this house," she said. She approached her children again for a collective hug. The room was instantly filled with Otto's excited squeals as Mary lifted the boy off the ground and attacked his face with loving smooches. Dorothy put her hand on my arm, guiding me back to the kitchen and asking of whether I'd had an evening meal, as Mary brought Otto along. I hadn't noticed, but the sun had lost its brilliant glare, and the ocean fog, done with industrious smoke, had begun to settle in among the streets. "What would you care to have for supper?" Mary asked me, pointing for Dorothy to take the apron from its hanger by the oven and assigning Otto a chair by the corner, likely so he wouldn't squirm about with company present. "I won't be a burden here, Mary. Whatever your family would is supper enough for me." "Grand. How about a nice buttered loaf to share and a pheasant roast? I'll get to the chopping. Dorothy, dear, if you'd like the tea. You're a guest tonight, Eloise, so you just keep your seat. You can keep to Otto for me." I was halfway to standing and reaching for another apron. Otto tried sitting, both feet scuffing the legs of his chair, and tried harder as his mother turned to him with a sternness becoming of a stone-faced troll. He settled and took the candy from his pocket, slipping it quick into the safety of his mouth as she turned around. I did not know what to do amidst a family dinner. I admit again that even in North End, where the faces were more their usuals, I avoided all attendance of gatherings and festivities. Their kitchen had room enough for the counters, blackened stovetop table and a pantry, which held all manner of things from the plucked pheasant to the pungent vegetable basket to the woodblocks for the oven. It was a feature of apartment living, I'd guessed, to have little room for a kitchen and more room for the parlor. The room had white-tiled walls and no window, ladles hanging from racks in the tiles, and hand-sewn towels in blue and gray threads draped over them. As Dorothy stoked the fires for both kettle and pheasant, I could feel the yellow glow of it traveling across the floor to my toes and up the shining white of the walls. The space came more to life with the light and the smell of crispy bird skins, and with the sound of Mary's barrage of questions about Dorothy's day. I learned over Otto's boasting that Dorothy was excelling in her classes, and that there was an opening at the large museum in town which she might fancy inquiring about, but only if her mother approved, of course, as it wasn't related to her core arithmetics. Apparently, if it wasn't assigned by the academy, it was likely a waste of Dorothy's time. She'd be of better use if she stuck to her studies, Mary insisted, since the museum, though important to the Keepers' Guild, was a place of the past, not of progress. And progress, Mary said, was everything. But they both agreed the museum would be the highlight of my trip a day past tomorrow, if Mary could just finish approving the bulging stack of travel permissions on her desk. By the time I'd helped to move the plated feast of bread, and potato mash, we'd all sat down with our cloth napkins and shuffled our chairs forward. Mary opened the stove to let the heat out. Every crackling tongue of the fire spat into the growing stillness, and a somberness fell over the room. Even the waggling of Otto's feet beneath the table came to a decisive halt. All at once, the Langstons' eyes fell closed, looking peaceful, the skin of their faces as soft as skin is as it sleeps. But my eyes were open. Dorothy opened her eyes for a moment, too, and she nodded to me with a funny mouthing of words, as if I were running late to classes, and closed them with the same somberness as Mary began to speak. Mary began and led a prayer, while her children mirrored her every move. Their hands rested on the table, palms down on their forks and knives, and they smiled a hopeful smile up to the ceiling where the few hanging candles' flames swayed like pocket-sized ghosts. O vigilance, principle devout, though the day be long and full of toils, for the betterment of our discipline let us eat in turns, Mary said, and passed the pheasant to Dorothy, who passed it to me, and me with a mustering of serious imitation to Otto, who behaved accordingly to my surprise. "And," she said, Let us say with confidence that we are more disciplined today than we were yesterday, and so enjoy the bounties of our meal. She passed the potatoes next. This was why I strayed away from dinner parties and always kept a block of houses between myself and the Speaker's chapel in North End. Not that anyone invited me to their homes, McCree's and Kershaw's aside. Thanks be owed. And for the betterment of our patients, Dorothy continued, let us eat with grace and thankfulness. Let us not rush to the work of tomorrow, for the work will always come, and we to meet it. Thanks. And little Otto's voice piped in. I want to eat and have more perseverance, because I have an essay at the end of the week, and because I don't want the belly bubbles in class. He giggled again, thinking himself cute, even with all of their eyes trapped closed in their solemn thoughtfulness. Mary shushed him with a strict slap on his right hand. I flinched to see his lip waver and turn hurt, but Dorothy seemed familiar enough with the act to tolerate it openly. It was the effect Mary wanted. The room was silent again, though I would from that day forward remember the sound. Yes, perseverance, Mary said. Let us be strong in the face of adversity, and deny the pleas of the weak, and follow justly the promises of vigilance who grants us all that we have earned. Let us ask for a good grade for Otto, a productive week of work for Dorothy, and an end to my stacks of paperwork. I think to ask for an end to this horrid spring rain as well. It's constricting my dirigible schedules. Anything you would like to ask for, Eloise? She couldn't have made me feel more conspicuous than if her eyes were open and upon me, and the kitchen was, in fact, an audience of scrutinous speakers. Yes, certainly. I held tightly to my fork and knife, knuckles stressed particularly against the gleaming metal of my mother's ring. I would have crossed my fingers over to ease my mind if I weren't so paralyzed. I did not believe in the being of fate they called vigilance, but to speak to the name caused a swirling, upchurning in my empty stomach as if the essence of my soul was twisting into an alignment. Vigilance, I said. I thank you for the safe travel. Won't you ask for anything? Dorothy nudged my foot under the table, gently. She was smiling to hear my prayer. I usually do not ask for anything. I swallowed. I never prayed, not like this. No? Mary opened her eyes on me, disappointment primed in her gaze. It would certainly be a wasted opportunity. Vigilance is generous, dear. We all ask for what is due. We've earned it. Come now, what do you want? The time ticked by within the shadows of Mary's eyes and the shivering sparks of the fire behind her. It hissed at me, a sizzling of dripping bird grease burning on the charred logs. Then I ask to never forget to tie my laces thrice. If there was ever a time to be composed, now was it. My lips were an impenetrable line of passivity as I teetered the line between mockery and enthusiasm. But Mary nodded in approval and closed her eyes happily. A simple but worthwhile thing. There's no virtue for modest prayers, but I commend you for starting small, Eloise. Vigilance, grant us what is due. For vigilance, she ended, and her children answered her. And then they began to eat, and all of the weight in the room rose like oven smoke and disappeared with more of Otto's laughter. I did little to eat, but stomached what forkfuls I could before my discomfort rose into the cavern of my heart. The escalation of my thoughts was hardly hindered by my forward intentions to nod and smile with their supper's conversation, as it became me too. I could not decide if the heat boiling in my gut was frustration or pure perplexity. I hadn't been to Stacy's in many months for supper. I was grateful to the Langstons, but I'd forgotten how the prayers of vigilantes were more like pleas. Stubborn pleas for trifles. They asked for more to bloat their life so easily, a good grade and a change to the weather. Was that what made their world continue turning? I thought of the abstract discipline, the manifested slap of a child's hand, and I felt emptied of all future compassion for this city. When it laid its sewers, like poisonous roots, into the clean soil, it banished any remnant of life, smothered it in existence with its columns of smoggy, slow death and grandiose dreams of empires. It was a culture of dissatisfaction, an everlasting push for progress, whatever that meant. But their metal beasts would never fly as birds or clouds do, and their bricks would never resemble mountains. I should go back to being a hermit where the grass slept undisturbed by carriage wheels and waist stitches, and the dinners were meant for one. There I could escape these ugly thoughts of those individuals across from me who had, after all, fed and offered me a bed under their roof. I was thankful to the Langstons, and fought with an angry heart to judge nothing but their ignorance of me and everything I believed in. The earth, the land, the life in and of it. Not magic by any means, but certainly the power of the world, its inherent goodness, all that which vigilance opposed. If they had the power to search my mind, they would surely not have allowed me a seat at their table that night. My feigned sameness was a necessary armor to wear in a place like this. I chewed and swallowed my dinner, thinking such things as subversive stew. I let Otto hold my hand under the table to stop his fidgeting. He will not remember it, as I hardly remember the happenings of my youth, but I pat the warm pink spot where the slap still showed bright, and I did pray, perhaps futilely. I wished on my mother's ring that one day no child would feel the sting of a barbarous word like discipline. Eloise? Mary's voice sent a shudder through my chest, an invisible tremble beneath the visceral cage of ribs and muscles. Yes? I blinked and put the final baked carrot into my mouth, the bland sweetness mushing between my teeth and tongue. Tomorrow, Dorothy and I will take you down to the docks. It's a wonderful time, and we haven't been since before the winter. I'm sure you'll delight in the view. We can stop to catch breakfast, too, Dorothy said. I won't have my classes until later in the afternoon. What a treat! I shoved every thought down, every inky drop of a thought, and stoppered them tight. I smiled. I would be so grateful to go. It would be good to see other parts of the city. Perhaps we can make a walk of it. And then I could put these disconcerting ramblings to rest. The city must have more beauty to it, more gardens, more happy faces, more life above the paved roads. And perhaps it would have more people like me, who loved to see the gardens grow up over the sidewalks and buildings. Of course, a walk would be lovely, Mary said, if the weather permits. Vigilance will grant me my due, I'm sure. She stood to excuse herself and set her dish in the sloshing water of the wash basin. Now, girls, if you're nearly done, I think the little one needs an uninterrupted night before his full day of lessons. We all looked to Otto, who had, in a haze of pheasant and butter, fastened his chin to his hand on the edge of the table and was exploring, unblinking, the depths of the gravy pool on his plate. What wonders he might have been thinking up. Mary roused Otto and pushed him with love to the kitchen's wash basin, and then into a room across the hall. After Dorothy shushed the candle lights in the kitchen, she led me into a separate room cluttered by 2 small beds and a window between them. My bags were already at the foot of one, with folded quilts and a pillow propped against the headboard. Let me apologize if it's a little messy, Dorothy said, shutting the door behind me with a subtle creak and going over to a large standing dresser. She began unbuttoning the front of her dress as I gazed around at the details of the room. No, I think it's perfect. I ignored whatever papers or works she had laid upon her desk, or the stockings covering the foot of her bed. But the rest of the room, like most girls, mine excepted, was filled with a whimsical feeling. Above Dorothy's bed was a blue tapestry trimmed with all colors of flowers, and a wind-up music box open on the bedside table displayed a collection of unpolished pearl jewelry. The wardrobe of dresses pressed against the wall was of a dark and old wood, carved with the whirling motions of sea tides. A great ship's sail beckoned the waves to push it along the long grains of the wood. It floated eternal above the tentacles of a great beast whose shape disappeared into the feet of the wardrobe. My eyes wandered, intrigued and jealous, as I too got myself undressed. But then I was reminded of the unnecessary lavishness of it all, and how I preferred my parents' empty room. One trunk of clothes made for a simple routine and less to launder. Pearls could be no more pretty than a string of daisies. Dorothy flung herself on the bed, sitting up and looking wide awake. I sat on my own cot. The quilts smelled exotic, an incomprehensible smell that was both entirely foreign and warm with heritage. "I think I'm too excited to fall asleep," Dorothy said. "I'm not usually allowed company during the weeks when the work's not done." She pulled one of her quilts around her, rocking gently side to side, looking from the clutter of her desk to the dark window. I don't think I could sleep now either. But I'm sure I felt worse than I looked. I was becoming practiced in my airs, I think. "Have you traveled far before?" "I've hardly ever traveled. It's easier than I could have imagined, at least with people to travel to. I'm sure it could have been much worse if I had no idea where I was going or no place to stay. What I was doing," I sighed, wondering. One day with Mary, and nothing had been divulged about my parents which I did not already know. "What are you doing here?" Dorothy asked. She wasn't rude and looked more interested than put out of the privacy of her room, but the question had been lurking in my mind as well for most of the day, likely ever since I decided to board that train. I must be looking for something. The town where I come from is becoming more complicated each day. It feels good to breathe away from all of that, and it has been lonely. "But you don't know what exactly you're looking for? It must be a big something, or else you must have been very eager to see us again." She smiled at me, but I could tell that she too, like her mother, did not want to press me. It was quiet. I spoke again, but quiet too, so as not to ruin the wholeness of the air. I didn't even recognize the sound of their names when I heard them today. My own parents. It's been so long since I truly felt I knew them. I can't forget them like that. I just thought, if I came here, something might change in me for the better. "I'm sorry." But Dorothy was still smiling. "I can only half understand. My father, you know, passed overseas. You and your parents never met him, I don't think, but he was a goodly man. And when Otto was born, my stepfather passed of a sickness. Sometimes I'm scared I'll catch it too. It plagued me when I was younger. I can tell by the way Mother looks at me around winter like a frail thing." She stopped swaying, and her eyes betrayed an unspoken sadness I could not hear in her steady voice. "Eloise, I know it's not easy to lose a part of your family. I don't know what I would do if I lost my mother too. She's everything to us. I have to remind myself, when I feel afraid, that vigilance keeps our souls and wouldn't betray us. I only have to prove myself worthy of the life I've been allowed." Her words prodded at my heart, already so raw and sore and vulnerable in the darkness of the room. I wrapped my quilt around my shoulders, the way I would while watching the rain in the morning. I already felt myself missing the rain. I mulled over the aching feeling in my throat, which had dulled itself over the years, now resurfacing as it had when I first read the letter. Forget vigilance. Dorothy had a kind heart. "Thank you, Dorothy." I pulled the quilt to my chin. "Can I ask you, before we tuck in?" And she leaned forward in reach of her candle beside the music box, light in the pearls. "Do you not like to ask Vigilance for anything in your usual prayers? I used to ask to make the crying stop when I thought of my father, and eventually it did, and then there was Otto, and everything was better for a turn. So many months of hard work and volunteering my time at our central chapel, so many hours devoting myself to action, to becoming a stronger person who needn't rely on the efforts of others. Vigilance gave me that, and here I am. I've never met someone who didn't ask for something." I looked at the floor as she waited. My stomach pricked with a cramp. There would be more of those if we continued with this. Say nothing of heresy was my immediate thought. Don't mention that you never pray, and definitely don't mention you'd much rather talk to flowers and songbirds than some invisible force of fate. "I believe I was taught a little differently," I said, reluctance souring my tongue. "I do not ask things of Vigilance because I was taught that we are born and made to persevere as we are. If I want to be brave, I must try to be brave. Some days I may be strong, other days weak, but I should not understand it as some dangerous fault, imperfection. It's a balance inherent to life which I cannot prevent from happening. With joys there are sorrows. I can only learn to move forward. It's how I was raised, you might say." "I don't think I've ever read that tenet before." "Any tenet quite like that. And I've read plenty," Dorothy said thoughtfully. "But what of happiness?" "No matter what I may try, I may never be perfectly happy. It is something one may learn, but even that cannot be true for every day of my life. I would be half of a person." And, I thought, as Dorothy turned her head curiously, I do not believe in a life where a soul is valued and measured worthwhile only by its utilitarian ability to achieve such successes as essays and paperwork, to further build up the city and leave behind anyone less capable. I could clearly picture those working in the factories and humbling apprenticeships in this city, and knew that in their prayers they would be asking for stitched clothes to keep themselves dry this spring. The unlucky few, or perhaps the majority, would likely not get their rewards on account of not working well enough in the eyes of Vigilance. I'd faced enough of that North End on my own time before Stacy thought to pity me. She was the only person in North End willing to let me work, even if it was behind closed doors. No one else would take me. But I knew Dorothy was young, and eating pheasant and decorating her room with trinkets as her mother had decorated the parlor with dusty nothings and self-important books. My mother decorated the yard with life, and the world with songs. I believed it was naive to think that the natural world, so chaotic and beyond me, worked around a law of idealized rewards, that the purpose of life could be unriddled by the accumulation of temporal proof. Regardless of who a person was, the world could end them as quickly as it wished, and nothing of theirs would matter much after that, save the memory of their face. No manner of work done in good faith could change that fate. Vigilance could not change that. Perhaps that's why people feared the wilds of the world and sought to tame it with axes and roads. It was completely unpredictable, and it couldn't be bothered by their prayers. But I said none of this. Dorothy spoke again. "I suppose I understand what you mean, that part about balance. My mother told me you were brought up a little different," Dorothy said. "But wouldn't it be nice to have a hand in how you're rewarded for working as hard as you do? We may not have the power you mentioned to prevent sorrow, but Vigilance does, after all. I'll always be wishing I worked harder to earn myself the best life." "It's good of you to want a good life," I whispered. Her hopefulness was admirable. Too much for me. Imagine the state of this city if she and every other follower of the guilds also wanted the best life for others as well. That's agreeable, I think. We only have one life to live. We may as well reap the rewards and prove we lived it well. And having said what she wanted, Dorothy leaned to blow out the candle. You look tired. Would you like to tuck in? I said nothing more. I nodded, cramps dwelling and inching into my back, pushing up the blood in my head. With a deep breath, the pain steadily receded. As I laid down, Dorothy snuffed the candle, and the pitch blackness sprung onto us, an instant blindness. I buried myself in the sheets to hide from the dark. In the shroud of the room, light from the outside street lamps filtered in through the window. Peeking from the bed, I could see, beyond the glass, the cold eyes of a stone, mossy-topped sea monster perched on the corner gutter of the nearest building. It glistened from a day in the fog, tinged with gold light from the lamps. I suddenly wished Dorothy had curtains, remembering, as a child might, how irrational fears more easily grip poor hearts when in the dark and the alone. If vigilance had demons, these gutter-dwelling statues were them. "Good night, Eloise," Dorothy whispered. Her breath was heavy and drawn. Even with her near presence, I feared the statue creature on the neighboring sill would crawl to scratch the window glass and whisper dangerous curses in my ear for all of the sacrilegious thoughts I had conjured up that day. "Good night," I said. When I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of ticking and winding before Dorothy rolled over in her bed. The music box began to play a melody. The bells rung throughout the stillness of the room and took over the atmosphere with dainty knells. It was a song one might hear only in a music box. It wasn't meant for dancing or for any nursery rhyme. The minor chords, like strange glances between strangers, lingered and overlapped. I'm sure it was meant to soothe the heart, but mine beat with irregular meditation. The music slowed. A white flash flew by the window by the sill of the creature. I opened my eyes to see a feather fall, and the flash passed into the starless night. I missed the stars. I spoke quietly. Do you believe in fate? In otherworldly powers? Something beyond vigilance, for I felt no truth in the word in my heart. Dorothy did not answer. I wondered if I'd spoken the words at all, or if my head was so loud with its squirming thoughts so as to imagine my own voice in the air. I reached in the dark to turn the music box round again, when its running gears ceased their faint clicking. I could have sworn the gutter statue watched.